Good morning. Good morning. I'm Vice Mayor Dennis Kavanaugh, and we have two meetings that we're going to be doing this morning. The first will be our Eastmark Community Facilities District #1 board meeting, followed by our study session. And we'd like to excuse Mayor Giles as he is out of state for the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And so first we'll go to the Eastmark Facilities Board meeting. And the first item is items from citizens present. Are there any requests to speak?
No request, Vice Chairman.
Thank you. And next is approval of minutes of our previous meetings. Is there a motion for approval? So moved. It's been moved and seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, that motion carries. Next item 3A is a presentation on the structure and governance for the Community Facilities District.
Good morning, Mr. Vice Chair and board members. My name is Mike Kennington. I'm the treasurer of the district. With me to my left is Mr. Scott Ruby, the counsel of the district from Gus Rosenfeld. Today we'd like to kick off the board meeting with kind of a refresher course. We have some new members of council and we haven't met for a while, so we kind of wanted to go through this high-level overview of the CFD.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, or Vice Chairman, members of the board, thank you for letting me come before you today. And as Mike mentioned, we'll just try to hit a 30,000-foot kind of look at this just to remind everybody where we're at with this process. As you know, Community Facilities District is formed by the city as a financing tool for public infrastructure located within the boundaries of a CFD or benefiting a CFD. The improvements actually could be outside the boundaries if there's a benefit. As I mentioned, the CFD is its own political subdivision once you create it, so it's its own taxing entity, and that's why you sit as an independent board for that purpose. It has, unlike most special districts, it has very broad powers. It has the power to levy fees and charges and impose operational ad valorem taxes. It can issue general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, assessment bonds, and that sort of thing. So it really is if you wanted to take it to its limits, it is a city within the city. The purpose behind them, of course, is to allow development to kind of pay for development in the context of that area benefits, so that area pays its burden. It's in particular, this Eastmark CFD came before you and you formed it. It was on the petition of the property owners at the time. You might recall that the DMB was the only property owner in that, or an affiliate of DMB in the Eastmark area. The property ownership changes from time to time as they sell off parcels to home builders and ultimately to end users. You form those based in response to that petition. You have to have an election. You have an election. Really, it's a two-prong election. It has to be approved. The formation has to be approved by both the property owners and the qualified electors being registered voters. In most scenarios, the formation of a CFD involves nothing but bare property. And so consequently, I think I've had one or two CFDs in my 25 years where we actually had qualified electors in the district. More likely than not, it's just a property owner-driven district, and the election by the property owner is usually unanimous because they're in favor of it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have submitted the petition. Once it's formed, you have a number of filings to make with the state and the county and that sort of thing. So you kind of get noticed by those entities as a tax levying public improvement district with the capabilities, as I mentioned before, to levy taxes. And as I said, it is a financing tool for public infrastructure, so you have the authority to construct and acquire and operate and maintain public infrastructure. But the main reason it's formed, again, is to finance public infrastructure through the issuance of bonds. The bonds are general obligation bonds or assessment bonds. You have the authority under a CFD to actually issue revenue bonds, but technically a CFD normally has no revenues. It doesn't operate a water system, doesn't operate an airport, doesn't operate a sewer system. So consequently, it doesn't have an enterprise from which revenues could be pledged. So what we see, and what certainly Mesa's experience has been thus far, we see general obligation bonds, which typically finance infrastructure that benefits the entire district. And then you see special assessment bonds, which finance infrastructure which benefits a more defined area inside the CFD itself. The financing takes place, as I mentioned, through general obligation tax levies. That's an ad valorem property tax similar to what you levy for your general obligation bonds. Special assessments are an actual lien placed on the benefited property. So if you're paving a street in front of 15 lots, then each lot is going to bear 1/15 of the cost of the street, and that finite dollar amount is levied against that parcel. Big difference from a real estate transaction standpoint, because when somebody goes to buy that lot, they will know exactly what the lien is in an assessment bond case. Whereas if it's a GO bond, when you go and you buy that lot, you realize that you are subject to, in our case, like a $3 tax, but you really don't know how much your lien is against your property. It's just a $3 tax levy based on your assessed valuation. So you will often see assessments being paid off much earlier than what you would typically see for a general obligation bond, because a general obligation bond really can't be paid until such time as it matures, whereas an assessment bond, you know that exact dollar amount. So when they go and get a mortgage, they'll oftentimes just roll that into a mortgage and pay that assessment off. You are the governing body of the Community Facilities District. If the district is over 600 acres, you do have the option to have an independent board. That's a little tricky for a variety of reasons. There's some tax law implications to that. There's also a constitutional requirement that people who govern a particular body should reside in that body. And so you always kind of wrestle with that. In our case, we have elected officials that serve the city as a whole, serving as the board, and so we meet that test. And in fact, again, in my 30 years, I've seen 2 instances where the city made the choice to have an independent board govern the CFD. Typically, and the primary reason you don't see that is because, as I mentioned before, this thing's extremely powerful from a governmental standpoint. You know, levying taxes and putting liens on people's property and charging fees and that sort of thing. Those are pretty powerful tools. And, you know, they don't turn that over typically to individuals who don't have that broader governmental perspective. And you also, you know, you're creating, in essence, a separate entity inside your entity, but it has incidental impact on you. I mean, you have ultimately 8,000 acres or 5,000 acres that are governed now by a CFD board that's levying a tax on them, in addition to the overall city concerns that levy taxes and that sort of thing. So you don't want to create any pockets of hostility towards, you know, any kind of financing plans or anything that the city may have. And you know, they basically eat up some of the tax tolerance. I put it on a political standpoint, but so that's why you see typically you all running them as opposed to an independent board. As an entity, you have budgets and open meeting law and everything. You have your own, tax levies through the county assessor, et cetera. And then today we're here. Let's look at the bond issues real quick, if we could. In fact, today we have an item for the Eastmark CFD, which is for the issuance of an assessment bond. DMB in particular has a business model where they are paying a portion, just a small portion, of the cost of the local infrastructure. In today's case, it's a street that goes through a particular area, and their business model is to place an assessment on each residential lot of not more than $3,500. And so consequently, the bond issue you see today is a small bond issue. It helps to finance a portion of the street, which benefits all of the lots that are going to be assessed.
Board Member Richens.
Is that a one-time assessment then? Just at $3,500 once? Is it upon the sale? Any ongoing costs associated with that to the property owner?
Board Member Richens, yes. In the case of the DMB business model, it is a one-time assessment of $3,500. There is nothing to preclude you as a board to come back in 5, 10, 15, 20 years and levy another assessment for some other improvement on the same property. But that's not, I've never seen that done either. Again, it creates a problem of priority of liens. But in this case, and in most cases, they'll levy an assessment of a certain amount on the lots for the initial infrastructure only. So going forward, that $3,500 will be a one-time fee.
So then they'll recoup that at the sale of the lot? Are most of the lots unsold at this point that they're assessing on?
What we end up doing in this case, we'll assess each residential lot $3,500, and that will begin to require payments, semi-annual interest payments and annual principal payments. And until that lot is sold, DMB makes those payments. Once the lot is sold, the individual, the homeowner, will step in the shoes of DMB, and they will pick up and start to pay the semi-annual interest payment and annual principal payment. That assumes, of course, they don't prepay that assessment. Yeah. Sometimes they do. Sometimes their mortgage company will say, we want that assessment paid off because it's a lien that's senior to my mortgage lien, and we don't want to take it subject to. So they will say, pay that off, pay that $3,500 off, usually through the mortgage proceeds themselves. Okay. But mortgage, again, depending on the nature, who the mortgage lender is, most of them understand these, and most of them, are okay with being second to the assessment lien. But, we've just gone through a pretty dramatic circumstance in the real estate world, and many lenders are taking a second look at this and saying, all right, do I really want to be second even to a $3,500 lien? Again, still most are coming out on the side of we're okay with that and we'll just continue on. That assessment is paid, in our case, over 25 years, so it somewhat parallels what a mortgage loan would be. And it is billed on the tax rolls itself, so they'll actually get a tax bill that has the school district and the city and every other taxing district that might overlap their property. And on there will be not only the CFD tax, but also the CFD assessment. So for convenience sake, they cut one check to the treasurer, and the treasurer then allocates that money appropriately back to the CFD so the CFD can pay its bonds. Now, until the time the resident actually occupies the property, the CFD, bills the developer directly. So rather than put it on the tax rolls and have DMB cut us 155 checks representing every lot, we just send one bill and get one check back. But once they start to sell lots, we put it on the tax roll. Okay. Any bond process for a CFD begins with a feasibility report. The feasibility report kind of summarizes what infrastructure is going to be financed, the nature of the benefit, and then the finance plan itself, what bonds will be issued, the term of the bonds, the expected interest rates, whether there's a reserve fund and that sort of thing. Today, you do have a feasibility report for this small issue for Assessment District Number 3. This is the third one we've done for Eastmark. And there is a hearing on that, and then all things being normal, you would approve the feasibility hearing or feasibility report. Once you do that, you then form the assessment district. Now, again, the assessment district is now a district inside the CFD, and it has its own distinct boundaries which are established by which properties benefit from the particular infrastructure we're improving. So again, in our case, we have a segment down at the bottom of the development of Eastmark that relates to just the particular lots that are benefited by one road that goes through there. So you've adopt a resolution of intention forming the district, then the next resolution, and we've combined them so we don't have to bombard you with paperwork. The next thing you do is you order that the work be performed or acquired. In this case, this district is not a construction district. In other words, we don't go sell bonds, receive money, and then go out and bid the contract and pay the contractor on a monthly basis until the work is performed. The work has already been constructed and finished, and so these bonds are issued and will reimburse the developer for the costs incurred in connection with the construction of that road. Consequently, DMB knows and has followed Title 34 bidding processes, et cetera, on this. So in essence, what that does, it converts it from a construction district to an acquisition district. We then, as a district, no longer take the construction risk, which, we just think that's a better way of proceeding. The other thing we do then is approve the assessment. In this case, you approve the dollar amount, the global dollar amount, the aggregate dollar amount, and you approve the allocation of that aggregate amount to a per lot basis. And in our case, as I mentioned before, it's $3,500. So that's another thing you're doing today. As I mentioned, the work is performed, and then we'll have one other, a couple other actions before you with respect to this. We will actually come back, we'll record the assessment so it then becomes a lien against the property. And finally, we'll come back to you with one more resolution that says, we hereby authorize that bonds be sold in the amount to finance the infrastructure. So you'll see us one more time on that. Okay. And we'll have a hearing at that time, which also says that the work was performed. So that's pretty much the assessment bond process. The GO bond process is even quicker than that. It's really no different than what you do as a city. You adopt well, let me back up here on the election. We cannot issue bonds, much like you can't issue bonds, unless the bond authority is approved by the electorate. And again, in this case, it requires approval by the property owner and the qualified electors. The bond authorization was approved at the time of formation, and so consequently, the only ones voting on it at that time were the property owners. They authorized a certain dollar amount to be issued or can be issued at your discretion over time. And so what we do with general obligation bonds, as I mentioned before, is typically finance with that instrument infrastructure which benefits the CFD as a whole, because the CFD, everyone in it, is paying for those particular bonds. So you'll see the arterial, the major roads, I'm not sure the designation Mesa gives them, but the major roads through Eastmark are financed with GO bonds, whereas the more residential roads are financed with assessment bonds. So once you have an election, then again, you have the project feasibility report, similar to what you have before the assessment bonds, and then you adopt a resolution authorizing the issuance of bonds to finance the particular infrastructure described in the feasibility report, and that is the last action you would take. We close the bond issue after it's sold. Larry Given gives us advice in that regard, and put the money in the bank and usually reimburse the developer next day or so. So with that, I don't mean to rush you through the process. I know some of you have heard this spiel 2, 3, 4 times, but it's always good to review it and take questions if you have any.
Questions for Mr. Ruby? Board Member Thompson.
Scott, can you kind of talk through some of the maybe micro and macro risks associated with CFDs and what those mean to the city as well as to the citizens?
Certainly. Let me divide the legal and credit risk from the political risk. The political risk, as I see it, is you create a particular segment of your community, you give them a vehicle to impose a greater tax on them. And so the folks moving into the Eastmark CFD will pay the city tax, but they're also going to pay the CFD tax. And so, as I mentioned before, you kind of eat up some tax tolerance there. I mean, everybody has their own threshold about what that is. You know, ideally, everyone's is 0, but they don't. So there is that political element to it. I think you got to be careful that your CFD doesn't issue so many bonds that you're charging a $17 tax rate, and then you turn around and try to have a city GO bond election, and that group of folks is saying, there's no way I'm voting for that because I want no more tax. So in response to that, there are some limits that kind of have evolved through the last 20 or 30 years, one of which is the CFD will not impose a tax greater than $3 for debt service and 30 cents for the operation and maintenance. That seems to be a level that's accepted by the market. We also mitigate the political risk by giving as much disclosure as possible to the resident when they move in. We have forms that they sign that acknowledge specifically that there is going to be an assessment and that there is going to be a tax, both an O&M and a debt service tax. So from that aspect, it's anticipated that it's not going to come as a surprise. It'll be on their title report. It'll be in a couple of real estate reports, et cetera. As far as the credit risk goes, there are 2 types of bonds that we mentioned, the assessment bonds and the GO bonds. The assessment bonds are the most risky bonds that I think you could issue because they are secured by the dirt. Okay, they are dirt bonds. So consequently, what we really look at in an assessment context is the value of the land. In the event the property owner were not to pay their assessment, then our remedy, in order to make sure the bondholder gets paid, is to foreclose on the land that was assessed. Now, if you assess the land for $100 and it's only worth $50, nobody's going to buy it at a foreclosure sale because you've got a land worth $50 and it's got a $100 lien on it. So what we do is we go in with a guideline that says we want to make sure the value of the land is equal to at least 4 times the value of the assessment. The 4 times kind of recognizes the volatility in the real estate market. We figure if it drops, then perhaps, we're still going to have that cushion where the property will be marketable upon a foreclosure. You don't always hit the mark. I've done deals where we had property 5.25 times the assessment, and within a year and a half, we were a little less than 1 to 1. Now we've bounced back. I mean, that was in the height of the problems here, but that it's been a pretty solid cushion, I think, for most circumstances. And then the other risk in that context is bankruptcy. If the property owner declares bankruptcy, you're precluded from foreclosing on the lot until those proceedings are terminated. And so consequently, the bondholders are wanting to be paid, but have no collateral upon which you can execute. So again, what we try to do to mitigate that risk is build in a debt service reserve fund, which will be drawn upon if necessary in order to get us through those kind of times. The other risk then on a GO side, GO tax, ad valorem property tax, just like any tax. If people don't pay their taxes, then those bonds would not get paid. And the bonds, though, are secured by an ad valorem property tax unlimited as to rate or amount. And so consequently, if half of you don't pay your taxes, what happens is they will levy whatever rate it takes in order to get those bonds paid. So the next year, if we've got a deficit, you may see your $3 rate go up to $3.10 in order to accommodate that sort of thing. Again, we structure GO bonds with some cushion. We don't structure GO bonds at the maximum amount that is debt serviced by $3. We say, okay, we're going to assume only 95% collections, and we'll size the bond issue down to that. We also will build in a few other circumstances, like we won't include property that is kind of a concentration of ownership where you have over 80% owned by one person. We have some mitigating circumstances in that regard. So we're aware of the risks, and we try to structure it accordingly to take care of that.
In this particular special assessment, it's 12 to 1, the appraised value to the lien amount. So
Yeah, we enjoy or like these smaller ones. The Pulte does their business model in Sun Cities. There's $2,000 per lot. I think their clientele is not quite as generous as the DMB clientele, but the 3,500, the 2,000 are very reasonable numbers because you're dealing with finished lots, and as Mike mentioned, you get some nice lean to value ratios, much better than even the 4 to 1.
So the letter of completion, of substantial completion, was issued yesterday to DMB. They received it, and so that's completed. It's 555 lots, as you guys have reviewed in your feasibility report. Scott's done a great job going over all the details, I think, that I was going to go over, but sorry. No, that's okay. You did it a lot better than I could.
That's okay. He's charging.
Fixed fee, and it's in the bond amount.
So we're open to further questions if the board would like.
Questions from the board? Okay, thank you. Then we move on to the public hearing to consider the feasibility report. Ms. Mickelson, are there any requests to speak for the public hearing?
No requests, Vice Chairman.
Any comments from the council? Now, Ms. Spinner, do we need to take a motion on this public hearing, or is the approval of the feasibility report really contained within the resolution that we would consider next?
Let me ask Scott if he wants a separate vote on the feasibility study.
Mr. Vice Chair, Debbie, you just need to close the public hearing, and then the resolution will approve the feasibility report.
Great.
As well as do a number of other things.
Well, with no requests to speak and no comments from the board, we'll declare the public hearing closed, and we'll move on to item 5A, which is to adopt a resolution approving the feasibility report, declaring its intent to acquire certain infrastructure improvements described in the report, forming a special assessment district, and ordering the public infrastructure projects to be acquired and performed within the Eastmark Community Facilities District Number 1. Okay, and, okay, we'll entertain a motion to approve the resolution. It's been moved and triple seconded. And any comments on the resolution? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, that motion carries.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. I just have to point out that Ms. Ruby is from the best graduating class from the ASU College of Law.
Yes, we have a number of esteemed politicians in that class. Phil
right.
Gordon was in that class, and Boyd Dunn was in that class.
right.
So a couple mayors and Councilmember Kavanaugh. So the rest of us are just slugging it through.